Hi, welcome. Hopefully you've had the chance to get the textbook by now and started on chapter one. If you haven't, I'd suggest do that as soon as you can. But I wanted to give you a brief introduction to California. All right, so just the name California itself, and it was first used in the 1500s to describe some type of an island paradise somewhere in the New World. It was sort of a mythical place, and the first appearance on a map came from Spanish maps that represented California as an island, because they were really exploring along Baja California and didn't really realize that it was really connected at the top. So they really were looking at the Baja Peninsula south of California, and that's the first appearance of the term California on a map. California is fairly large in size. It's the third largest state, the other two being Alaska and Texas. But after that, California is quite large. And you could fit a line about 760 miles long from one corner to the other. So it is quite large, and also it extends really far north and south. So from the south to the north, you have quite a bit of distance. And as we talk about latitude, your measurement from north to south, it covers a lot of different types of environments just because of its extent in latitude, north and south. And a lot of coastline, at least 1,200 miles or so of coastline. It's hard to know the exact length because it depends on how closely you look at the coastline. Because the closer you get, the more detailed it gets and the longer it gets. And it has more than 3,000 miles if you count all of the bays and the rivers and whatever else. It's about 400 miles wide at the widest down at the bottom, and it narrows to about 150 miles at its most narrow point. In terms of people, it's the most populated state. I taught this class about maybe 8 years ago, and I've had to update this now. We are up at around 40 million people in California currently, or just under that. 39, if you round that up, we're at about 40 million people. And we also have two of the largest urban areas of the United States, in Los Angeles and the San Francisco Bay Area. And the one framework that we use to kind of understand California is looking at just different elements of geography. So I just want to go over this really quickly. This is a little bit more expanded than what was in the introduction lectures about basics of geography. So we talked a little bit about location, the world in spatial terms like absolute location, and even relative location, and latitude and longitude. This is about where things are. So we'll look at it in those terms. Places and regions, how we organize space. We're going to talk about physical regions of California today. And we're going to study physical systems in California. We're going to study California's physical environment. And that's what we're going to do at sort of the beginning of the semester, is focus a lot on the physical environments of California. And then we'll transition into talking about the human systems in California, urban areas, industry, agriculture, and that type of thing. And then we'll also discuss how those two blend together in what we call human environmental interaction. And lastly, another concept is the uses of geography, or applied geography. And this is about using tools like geographic information systems or remote sensing to help us better understand the world around us. So we will actually have some activities where we actually use some of these tools to help understand California. I just want to show a few maps to round things out. We're going to be looking next at California's physical regions, and I just want to show, this is the physical regions on a map. We have things like the Great Central Valley and the Sierra Nevada. And this is showing the amount of rainfall places get. So we will kind of use this as a framework to understand how some of these regions are different from one another. So in For example, in Northern California, it's extremely wet. This is high amount of precipitation. Whereas in this inland corner down here, it is extremely arid and dry. We'll also be looking at, through the course, things like what we call land use. What kind of physical environment is there in both terms of vegetation, like forests, farmland, like this stuff in green in the Central Valley, and also places that are more desert-like or grasslands. We'll also look at things like public lands, so all these areas in red that are in the desert and the forest, a lot of those are owned by the federal government, where most of the farmland is not. And the type of land use or land cover also impacts where people live as well. That places that are wetter and less and more hospitable and have more agriculture support greater population densities. One of the concepts is situation, which is another way of saying relative location. And one aspect of California's situation or its relative location is that it sits along tectonic plate boundaries. For the next chapter, we're going to go into a little more detail on this, but essentially, California is on what's called the Pacific Ring of Fire. This is an area that's prone to more earthquakes and volcanoes, and these are mountain building processes. So that helps to create California and the West Coast in general as a more mountainous environment. And because of the way that our mountains are arranged, that much of California is actually quite isolated. We call it physiographic isolation. So for example, the Central Valley, there are barriers between the Central Valley and other parts of the United States. So we have things like what we call endemic species that evolved in isolation in California that you don't find in other places. We have a lot of unique wildlife and that evolved here and not in others, and here alone. This also really isolated some of the pre-European cultures in California, that some of the cultures like here in the valley were fairly isolated from other parts of the United States because of barriers like the Sierra Nevada. But in many ways, we're also very connected through the ocean, that we are on what's called the Pacific Rim. So around the Pacific Ocean, we have a lot of trade connections with Mexico, South America, Asia, and the connections by sea increase trade and migration to California. And I just want to end this brief introduction with this slide. If you're driving between Fresno and Madera on Highway 99, this is the pine and the palm, and what they're meant to symbolize is conceptually is where Northern California and Southern California split up. So while we can measure where the geographic center is mathematically, we also have conceptions of where is Northern California, Southern California, and that type of thing. But a lot of these are just that. They're conceptions. They're way that they're what we call vernacular regions, what we just call places, and the way we imagine them. All right, and so that's just a really brief introduction. I will be adding more material as we go, and I'm going to end that here.